History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 4 The Age of Diverging Traditions. Chapter 10 Europe, the First Revolution. The temperament of Gregory VII was no emollient in this delicate situation. Once elected, he took his throne without imperial assent, simply informing the emperor of the fact. 2 years later, he issued a decree on lay investiture. Curiously, what it actually said has not survived, but its general consent is known. Gregory forbade any layman to invest a cleric with a bishopric or other ecclesiastical office and excommunicated some of the emperor's clerical counselors on the grounds that they had been guilty of simony in purchasing their preferment. To cap matters, Gregory summoned the Emperor Henry IV to appear before him and defend himself against charges of misconduct. Henry responded at first through the church itself. He got a German synod to declare Gregory deposed. This earned him excommunication, which would have mattered less had he not faced powerful enemies in Germany, who now had the Pope's support. The result was that Henry had to give way to avoid trial before the German bishops presided over by Gregory, who was already on his way to Germany. Henry came in humiliation to Canossa, where he waited in the snow barefoot until Gregory would receive his penance in one of the most dramatic of all confrontations of lay and spiritual authority. But Gregory had not really won. Not much of a stir was caused by Canossa at the time. The Pope's position was too extreme. He went beyond canon law to assert a revolutionary doctrine that kings were but officers who could be removed when the Pope judged them unfit or unworthy. This was almost unthinkably subversive to men whose moral horizons were dominated by the idea of the sacredness of oaths of fealty. It foreshadowed later claims to papal monarchy, but was bound to be unacceptable to any king. Investiture ran on as an issue for the next 50 years. Gregory lost the sympathy he had won through Henry's bullying, and it was not until 1122 that another emperor agreed to a concordat which was seen as a papal victory, though one diplomatically disguised. Yet Gregory had been a true pioneer. He had differentiated clerics and laymen as never before and had made unprecedented claims for the distinction and superiority of papal powers. More would be heard of them in the next 2 centuries. Though his immediate successors acted less dramatically than he, they steadily pressed papal claims to papal advantage. Urban II used the First Crusade to become the diplomatic leader of Europe's lay monarchs. They looked to Rome, not the empire. Urban also built up the church's administrative machine. Under him emerged the Curia, a Roman bureaucracy which corresponded to the household administrations of the English and French kings. Through it, the papal grip on the church itself was strengthened. In 1123, a historic date, the first ecumenical council was held in the West and its decrees were promulgated in the Pope's own name. And all the time, papal jurisprudence and jurisdiction ground away. More and more legal disputes found their way from the local church courts to papal judges, whether resident at Rome or sitting locally. Prestige, dogma, political skill, administrative pressure, judicial practice, and the control of more and more benefices all buttressed the new ascendancy of the papacy within the church. By 1100, the groundwork was done for the emergence of a true papal monarchy. As the investiture contest receded, secular princes were on the whole well disposed to Rome, and it appeared that no essential ground had been lost by the papacy. There was indeed a spectacular quarrel in England over the question of clerical privilege and immunity from the law of the land, which would be an issue of the future. Immediately, it provoked the murder and then the canonization of Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. But on the whole, the large legal immunities of clergy were not much challenged. Under Innocent III, papal pretensions to monarchical authority reached a new theoretical height. True, Innocent did not go quite as far as Gregory. He did not claim an absolute plenitude of temporal power everywhere in Western Christendom, but he said that the papacy had, by its authority, transferred the empire from the Greeks to the Franks. Within the church, his power was limited by little, but the inadequacies of the bureaucratic machine through which he had to operate. Yet, papal power was still often deployed in support of the reforming ideas, which shows that much remained to be done. Clerical celibacy became more common and more widespread. Among new practices which were pressed on the church in the 13th century was that of frequent individual confession, a powerful instrument to control in a religiously minded and anxiety ridden society. Among doctrinal innovations, the theory of transubstantiation, that by a mystical process the body and blood of Christ were actually present in the bread and wine used in the communion service, were imposed from the 13th century onwards. The final christening of Europe in the Central Middle Ages was a great spectacle. Monastic reform and papal autocracy were wedded to intellectual effort and the deployment of new wealth in architecture to make this the next peak of Christian history after the age of the Fathers. It was an achievement whose most fundamental work lay perhaps in intellectual and spiritual developments, but it became most visible in stone. What we think of as Gothic architecture was the creation of this period. It produced the European landscape, which until the coming of the railway was dominated or punctuated by a church tower or spire rising above a little town. Until the 12th century, the major buildings of the church were usually monastic. Then began the building of the astonishing series of cathedrals, especially in northern France and England, which remains one of the great glories of European art and together with castles constitutes the major architecture of the Middle Ages. There was great popular enthusiasm, it seems, for these huge investments, though it is difficult to penetrate to the mental attitudes behind them. Analogies might be sought in the feeling of 20th century enthusiasts for space exploration, but this omits the supernatural dimension of these great buildings. They were both offerings to God and an essential part of the instrumentation of evangelism and education on earth. About their huge naves and aisles moved the processions of relics and the crowds of pilgrims who had come to see them. Their windows were filled with the images of the biblical story, which was the core of European culture. Their facades were covered with the didactic representations of the fate awaiting just and unjust. Christianity achieved in them a new publicity and collectiveness, nor is it possible to assess the full impact of these great churches on the imagination of medieval Europeans without reminding ourselves how much greater was the contrast their splendor presented to the reality of everyday life than any imaginable today. The power and penetration of organized Christianity were further reinforced by the appearance of new religious orders. Two were outstanding: the Mendicant Franciscans and Dominicans, who in England came to be called respectively the Grey and Black Friars from the colors of their habits. The Franciscans were true revolutionaries. Their founder, Saint Francis of Assisi, left his family to lead a life of poverty among the sick, the needy, and the leprous. The followers who soon gathered about him eagerly took up a life directed towards the imitation of Christ's poverty and humility. There was at first no formal organization, and Francis was never a priest. But Innocent III, shrewdly seizing the opportunity of patronizing this potentially divisive movement instead of letting it escape from control, bade them elect a superior. Through him, the new fraternity owed and maintained rigorous obedience to the Holy See. They could provide a counterweight to local episcopal authority because they could reach and preach without the license of the bishop of the diocese. The older monastic orders recognized a danger and opposed the Franciscans. But the friars prospered despite internal quarrels about their organization. In the end, they acquired a substantial administrative structure of their own, but they always remained peculiarly the evangelists of the poor and the mission field. The Dominicans sought to further a narrower end. Their founder was a Castilian priest who went to preach in the Languedoc to heretics, the Albigensians. From his companions grew a now preaching order. When Dominic died in 1221, his 17 followers had become over 500 friars. Like the Franciscans, they were mendicants, vowed to poverty, and like them too, they threw themselves into missionary work. But their impact was primarily intellectual, and they became a great force in a new institution of great importance, just taking shape, the first universities. Dominicans came also to provide many of the personnel of the Inquisition, an organization to combat heresy, which appeared in the early 13th century. From the 4th century onwards, churchmen had urged the persecution of heretics. Yet the first papal condemnation of them did not come until 1184. Only under Innocent III did persecution come to be the duty of Catholic kings. The Albigensians were certainly not Catholic, but there is some doubt whether they should really be regarded even as Christian heretics. Their beliefs reflect Manichaean doctrines. They were dualists, some of whom rejected all material creation as evil. Like those of many later heretics, heterodox religious views were taken to imply aberration or at least non-conformity in social and moral practices. Innocent III seems to have decided to persecute the Albigensians after the murder of a papal legate in the Languedoc, and in 1209 a crusade was launched against them. It attracted many laymen, especially from northern France, because of a chance it offered for a quick grab at the lands and homes of the Albigensians. But it also marked a great innovation, the joining of state and church in Western Christendom, to crush by force dissent which might place either in danger. It was for a long time an effective device, though never completely so. In judging the theory and practice of medieval intolerance, it must be remembered that the danger in which society was felt to stand from heresy was appalling. Its members might face everlasting torment. Yet, persecution did not prevent the appearance of new heresies again and again in the next 3 centuries. Because they expressed real needs, heresy was, in one sense, an exposure of a hollow core in the success which the Church had so spectacularly achieved. Heretics were living evidence of dissatisfaction with the outcome of a long and often heroic battle. Other critics would also make themselves heard in due course and different ways. Papal monarchical theory provoked counter doctrine. Thinkers would argue that the Church had a defined sphere of activity, which did not extend to meddling in secular affairs. As men became more conscious of national communities and respectful of their claims, this would seem more and more appealing. The rise of mystical religion was yet another phenomenon, always tending to slip outside the ecclesiastical structure. In movements like the Brethren of the Common Life, following the teachings of the mystic Thomas à Kempis, laymen created religious practices and devotional forms which sometimes escaped from clerical control. Such movements expressed the great paradox of the medieval church. It had risen to a pinnacle of power and wealth. It deployed vast estates, tithes, and papal taxation in the service of a magnificent hierarchy whose worldly greatness reflected the glory of God and whose lavish cathedrals, great monastic churches, splendid liturgies, learned foundations, and libraries embodied the devotion and sacrifices of the faithful. Yet the point of this huge concentration of power and grandeur was to preach a faith at whose heart lay the glorification of poverty and humility and the superiority of things not of this world. The worldliness of the church drew increasing criticism. It was not just that a few ecclesiastical magnates lolled back upon the cushion of privilege and endowment to gratify their appetites and neglect their flocks. There was also a more subtle corruption inherent in power. The identification of the defense of the faith with the triumph of an institution had given the church an increasingly bureaucratic and legalistic face. The point had arisen as early as the days of Saint Bernard. Even then, there were too many ecclesiastical lawyers, it was said. By the mid 13th century, legalism was blatant. The papacy itself was soon criticized. At the death of Innocent III, the Church of Comfort and of the Sacraments was already obscured behind the granite face of centralization. The claims of religion were confused with the assertiveness of an ecclesiastical monarchy, demanding freedom from constraint of any sort. It was already difficult to keep the government of the church in the hands of men of spiritual stature. Martha was pushing Mary aside because administrative and legal gifts were needed to run a machine which more and more generated its own purposes. In 1294, a hermit of renowned piety was elected pope. The hopes this roused were quickly dashed. Celestine V was forced to resign within a few weeks, seemingly unable to impose his reforming wishes on the Curia. His successor was Boniface VIII. He had been called the last medieval pope because he embodied all the pretensions of the papacy at its most political and its most arrogant. He was by training a lawyer and by temperament far from a man of spirituality. He quarreled violently with the kings of England and France, and in the Jubilee of 1300 had two swords carried before him to symbolize his procession of temporal as well as spiritual power. 2 years later, he asserted that a belief in the sovereignty of the Pope over every human being was necessary to salvation. Under him, the long battle with the kings came to a head. Nearly 100 years before, England had been laid under interdict by the Pope. This terrifying sentence forbade the administration of any of the sacraments while the king remained unrepentant and unreconciled. Men and women could not have their children baptized or obtain absolution for their own sins, and those were fearful deprivations in a believing age. King John had been forced to yield. A century later, things had changed. Bishops and their clergy were often estranged from Rome, which had undermined their authority too. They could sympathize with the stirring national sense of opposition to the papacy, whose pretensions reached their peak under Boniface. When the kings of France and England rejected his authority, they found churchmen to support them. They also had resentful Italian noblemen to fight for them. In 1303, some of them pursued the old pope to his native city and there seized him with, it was said, appalling physical indignity. His fellow townsmen released Boniface, and he was not to die in confinement, but die he did, no doubt, of shock a few weeks later. This was only the beginning of a bad time for the papacy, and some would claim for the church. For more than 4 centuries, it was to face recurrent and mounting waves of hostility, which, though often heroically met, ended by calling Christianity itself in question. Even by the end of Boniface's reign, the legal claims he had made were almost beside the point. No one stirred to avenge him. Now, spiritual failure increasingly drew fire. Henceforth, the papacy was to be condemned more for standing in the way of reform than for claiming too much of kings. For a long time, though, criticism had important limits. The notion of autonomous, self justified criticism was unthinkable in the Middle Ages. It was for failures in their traditional religious task that churchmen were criticized. In 1309, a French pope brought the papal curia to Avignon, a town belonging to the King of Naples but overshadowed by the power of the French kings, whose lands overlooked it. There was to be a preponderance of French cardinals, too, during the papal residence at Avignon, which lasted until 1377. The English and Germans soon believed the popes had become the tool of the French kings and took steps against the independence of the church in their own territories. The imperial electors declared that their vote required no approval or confirmation by the pope and that the imperial power came from God alone. At Avignon, the popes lived in a huge palace whose erection was a symbol of their decision to stay away from Rome and whose luxury was a symbol of growing worldliness. The papal court was an unexampled magnificence, attended by a splendid train of servitors and administrators paid for by ecclesiastical taxation and misappropriation. Unfortunately, the 14th century was a time of economic disaster. A much reduced population was being asked to pay more for a more costly papacy. Centralization continued to breed corruption. The abuse of papal rights to appoint to vacant benefices was an obvious instance, and accusations of simony and pluralism had more and more plausibility. The personal conduct of the higher clergy was more and more obviously at variance with apostolic ideals. A crisis arose among the Franciscans themselves. Some of the brothers, the spirituals, insisting that they take seriously their founder's rule of poverty, while their more relaxed colleagues refused to give up the wealth which had come to their order. Theological issues became entangled with this dispute. Soon there were Franciscans preaching that Avignon was Babylon, the scarlet whore of the apocalypse, and that the papacy's overthrow was at hand, while a pope asserting that Christ himself had respected property condemned the ideal of apostolic poverty and unleashed the Inquisition against the spirituals. They were burned for their preachings, but not before they had won audiences. Thus, the exile in Avignon fed a popular anti clericalism and anti papalism, different from that of kings exasperated against priests who would not accept their jurisdiction. Many of the clergy themselves felt that rich abbeys and worldly bishops were a sign of a church that had become secularized. This was the irony that tainted the legacy of Gregory VII. Criticism eventually rose to the point at which the papacy returned to Rome in 1377, only to face the greatest scandal in the history of the Church. A great schism. Secular monarchs set on having quasi national churches in their own realms, and the college of 20 or so cardinals manipulating the papacy so as to maintain their own revenues and position together brought about the election of two popes, the second by the French cardinals alone. For 30 years, popes at Rome and Avignon simultaneously claimed the headship of the church. 8 years afterwards, there was a third contender as well. As the schism wore on, the criticism directed against the papacy became more and more virulent. Antichrist was a favorite term of abuse for the claimant to the patrimony of St. Peter. It was complicated by the involvement of secular rivalries too. For the Avignon Pope, Broadly, there stood as allies France, Scotland, Aragon, and Milan. The Roman was supported by England, the German emperors, Naples, and Flanders. Yet the schism at one moment seemed to promise renovation and reformation. The instrument to which reformers turned was an ecumenical or general council of the church. Some claimed for it an authority overriding that of Pope. In any case, to return to the days of the apostles and the fathers for a way of putting the papal house in order sounded good sense to many Catholics. Unfortunately, the idea did not turn out well. Four councils were held. The first at Pisa in 1409 struck out boldly, proclaiming the deposition of both popes and choosing another. This meant that there were now three pretenders to the chair of St. Peter. Moreover, when the new one died after a few months, another was elected whose choice was said to be tainted by simony. This was the first, John the 23rd, now no longer recognized as an authentic pope and the victim of one of Gibbon's most searing judgments. The next council, Constance 1414 to 1418, removed John, though he had summoned it, got one of his competitors to abdicate, and then deposed the third pretender. At last, there could be a fresh start. The schism was healed. In 1417, a new pope was elected, Martin V. This was a success, but some people had hoped for more. They had sought reform, and the council had been diverted from that. Instead, it had devoted its time to heresy, and support for reform dwindled once the unity of the papacy was restored. After another council, Siena, 1423 to 24, had been dissolved by Martin V for urging reform. That supreme pontiff should be called to account was perilous, he declared. The last met at Basel, 1431 to 1449. But this was ineffective long before its dissolution. The consular movement had not achieved the desired reform, and papal power was restored. The principle that there existed an alternative consular source of authority inside the church was for the next 400 years regarded with suspicion at Rome. Within a few years, it was declared heresy to appeal from the Pope to a general council. The church had not risen to the level of the crisis now upon it. The papacy had maintained its superiority. But its victory was only partial. Secular rulers had reaped the benefits of anti-papal feeling in new freedoms for national churches. As for the moral authority of Rome, that had clearly not been restored, and one result would be a more damaging movement for reform. 3/4 of a century later, the papacy had already begun to look more and more Italian, and so it was to remain. There were some dismal popes to come in the next 2 centuries, but that did less damage to the church than the evolution of their see towards becoming just one more Italian state. Heresy, always smoldering, had burst out in a blaze of reforming zeal during the consular period. Two outstanding men, Wycliffe in England and Huss in Bohemia, focused the discontents to which schism had given rise. They were first and foremost ecclesiastical reformers, although Wycliffe was a teacher and thinker rather than a man of action. Huss became the leader of a movement which involved national as well as ecclesiastical issues. He exercised huge influence as a preacher in Prague. He was condemned by the Council of Constance for heretical views on predestination and property and was burnt in 1415. The great impulse given by Wycliffe and Huss flagged as their criticisms were muffled. But they had tapped a vein of national anti-papalism which was to prove so destructive of the unity of the Western Church. Catholics and Hussites were still disputing Bohemia in bitter civil wars 20 years after Jose's death. Meanwhile, the papacy itself made concessions in its diplomacy with the lay monarchies of the 15th century.